Alright, and now on to the actual render settings themselves. So let's go ahead and click on the render settings, which is the movie clapboard with the two buttons to the left of it, and you should see something like this. Be sure you are render using My Hardware 2.0. If it's anything else, it'll either not render out properly, or everything will look a lot different than what it should. So everyone make sure you have Hardware 2.0 set up as the option selected in render using. And I'm just going to, even though I set all of these up for you, I want to just talk about some of these things and also explain why some of these are set the way they are. So the file name prefix, by default this is left blank, and it just uses whatever is your scene name. But if you want something more specific for the name of the movie file or the frames that get rendered out, then you would type it in here. And the reason why I'm not using AVI as the image format here, even though that is a option, is that unfortunately all of the codecs, all the video codecs, in other words all of the software that is used to compress the video that is available at the school by default, none of those are really high quality. Ultimately you're going to want something that is either H.264 or I believe the latest standard that has very good compression to quality ratio is HEVC. I think that's the acronym for it. It's supposed to be the next generation of H.264. It has even better compression. It basically compresses files further while giving the same level of quality. So if you have some codecs like those installed on your machine, then you could use the AVI option, but without it, because I didn't see any of those on the school's computers, what we're going to do is we're going to just render out frames, in this case PNG, because they're relatively small in size compared to say Targas and TIFFs, and then we're going to take those sequential frames, and then in Photoshop there are some pretty good built-in compression schemes within Photoshop that we're going to use instead to generate the final video. So it's a little more involved, a little more time consuming, but it's going to allow us to have a much better quality than what we would get by simply using the default codecs and AVI. So we're going to do PNG, okay? And then whenever you are rendering frames, usually the file animation extension I use is name.number.extension. That has always worked well for me in all the production projects I've worked on. And frame padding is basically, if you look at how the numbers are, so see how it's going to start at frame quadruple 0, and then it's going to end on frame 0144. And watch how that changes as I decrease the frame padding. You see how it takes off that 0 in the front, and then if my frame padding is all the way to 0, as you can see, it doesn't put any numbers in front, which from most cases, as far as how software reads these files in, it shouldn't be a problem. But if you were to just organize by name within Windows Explorer or some sort of file browser, you might get a situation in which you're going to see frame 1, and then immediately after that, instead of frame 2, you're going to see frame 10, because there's a 1 in that at that decimal place. So that's why frame padding is usually good to use, and you usually don't need more than 4, because for any given shot it's unlikely you're going to have more than 10,000 frames. So this is usually a good standard to use whenever rendering out sequential frames. And now further down, as you can see, we're rendering from frame 0 to 144. Now when I was explaining this in class several weeks ago, I said that we're not going to render what I call the wraparound frame, because at frame 0 and at frame 144 it's so at frame 0 it's at 0 degrees, and at frame 144 it's 360 degrees, which are actually the exact same angle. So if we were to loop the animation and the frame 0 and frame 144 play one after the other, it looks like it holds the same position for 2 frames, which it is noticeable. It definitely is noticeable. You're going to see a slight stutter, a slight pause when it comes to that angle. So what I usually do is I don't render out that 1 frame. However, I have noticed the problem. This is either a DX11 issue or my hardware render issue, or just a general my issue. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but sometimes what happens is the very first frame seems to be gamma corrected incorrectly. In other words, it looks like it's brighter than all the other frames. That's why what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and render frame 0. That's kind of my sacrificial frame. It's going to ultimately get deleted, but I need to render it so that if there's any kind of wrong gamma correction or any kind of brightening that's happening on a frame, that I'm going to delete anyway, rather on the actual first frame that I'm going to use. So just keep the numbers the way they are. So we're going to start rendering from frame 0, and we're going to end at frame 144. And also, this should already be set for you, but we want to be sure that our renderable camera is, instead of perspective camera, it's turntable camera 1. And also, you might have noticed that this camera is locked because I don't want you to accidentally nudge it off out of place. So it's locked so that it only moves with its animation keys. You cannot manually move the camera off its spot. Okay, so all these settings are good, and I mean, you could change the aspect ratio if you want, although this which is more of a portrait orientation, seems to work better than a landscape one, because there's not too much to see horizontally, but there's a lot to see vertically. So that's why I use this particular aspect ratio. This is all you really need. This is definitely high enough res for use in a demo reel or anything else of that nature. So if you really want a higher res, what you can do is you can check on maintain width height ratio, and then whenever you change the resolution for one dimension, it'll automatically change it for the other. So for example, if I type in 1280 for the height and then just click off it, as you can see, it automatically changed the width to 960. So it saves you from having to do your own calculations and or retyping numbers. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and keep it as is. Okay, and then just a couple of things I want to turn back on. Remember earlier on, just to get a little better performance, I turned off ambient occlusion and turned off anti-aliasing. Okay, well, those were off, but I think when I was setting things up, I might have turned them on just to test. So most of these things we don't have to worry about too much, but definitely under the screen space ambient occlusion, you want to enable it. And you can definitely play around with these settings, but the settings that you see here work pretty well for me. And for anti-aliasing, I'm going to check on both smooth wireframe enable and multi-sample anti-aliasing enable. And also, this has this brightening effect that may not be desirable. Okay, well, sometimes it creates a brightening effect. Depends on some of the settings you have in your shaders. But for the best results, I would just go ahead and leave this on under the gamma correction. And then for floating point target, I usually have this enabled, and this usually allows you to get a better result, and it reduces the likelihood of color banding when you do your render. So it's usually gives you a higher quality result if you have your floating point render target enabled. And those are already enabled for you. I'm just explaining what some of these settings do. And all the rest we really don't need to be concerned about. Okay. And once all those settings are set, as I've explained them, then you can go ahead and close this, and then to actually render out those frames,